Welcome to Culture Crush with me, your host, Dan Dowman, where we get to meet some of the world's leading culture shapers, future makers, and power shakers. We'll be talking groundbreaking cultures, leadership challenges, and what you can do about them. Today, I'm joined by David Manser. David, it's great to have you on the show.
Thanks very much, Dan. It's great to be here.
Now, you've been at IKEA for decades and have spent the last few years as a market manager, which, if I've understood that correctly, means you're responsible for IKEA across an entire region. Mm-hmm. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about your story, your pathway to kind of this leadership level at scale, and why you've stayed with IKEA for this amount of time?
Yeah, thank you. Great first question to throw at me. So my journey began around about 28 years ago, 28, 29. You kind of forget when it gets to be that long. I was fresh out of university, looking to sort of make my mark in the world. And there was an advert, I was living in London, because, you go to London when you finish university. I think it was the Evening Standard or something. And they were looking for trainee managers. There was something about it that was kind of interesting. And I remember going down to visit the store, the Croydon store on the Purley Way. This would have been somewhere, I guess, 1995. And, I was bowled over when I went in there. It was kind of like, what is this place? It was super exciting. It was super interesting. And then, you kind of go through the process. And I didn't realize it so much at the time, but, you get a sense of maybe the culture that's there and how the people were and how I was treated. And I met lots of people, and the recruitment process seemed to go on for ages and ages and ages. But eventually they came back and sort of said, would you like to come and work for us? And I said, yes. And as is the way of things, I wasn't entirely sure at that point. But, let's give it a go. I was at least curious. I was at least interested. I'd like what I'd seen up until that point. And then it kind of, just every sort of 18 months or so, they kept asking me if I wanted to do something more, something different. And what I didn't realize at the time, but I was kind of moving up slowly through the organization, step by step. And my path was very much, from the shop floor up. It wasn't like some sort of superstar who just kind of like blazes across the sky and straight to the top. It was very, step. I learned the business from the bottom up. And of course, what you don't realize is how much that sort of stands you in good stead for later on when you're maybe taking a leadership role. And then, I don't know, somewhere around about after 10 years or so, your career comes to a natural sort of crossroads and you have opportunities. And the opportunity that came up for me was actually to go abroad with IKEA. And I went to Norway. And that was totally different. And that opened my eyes in a completely different way. Because, we could say IKEA is like a concept retailer. If you see it in London or you see it in Lisbon, it should essentially be the same. But you go to Norway and then you start to throw in the people dimension and the fact that the culture is slightly different, the ways of working, some of the assumptions that come into it. So that was great. That was really exciting, learning a lot. And then about sort of a year and a half later, I had the chance to go to Finland. Now, I have to be completely honest and say, things I wrote on my list of things to do with my life when I was a little boy, going to Finland was not one of them. But it turned out to be one of those great decisions where you just kind of go with it. And again, different people, different way of working with things, but also all of that knowledge that I picked up. You get to a situation where suddenly you realize that you're starting to add value. You're starting to be able to help people around you. You're starting to be able to develop people, and that gets really exciting. So I did that for about 6 years. And then again, another opportunity came up, and I got the opportunity this time to move to Switzerland, which was, as you could imagine, terrible. All that chocolate, it was brilliant. And I actually stayed in Switzerland for about 10 years, working pretty much as a market manager. At that time, it was called a store manager. And then at some point, they came along and they changed it to a market manager. And then it was time to come home. And I've been very lucky since then to sort of come back to the UK organization and be the market manager in Milton Keynes. And then you sort of talked about the region. So we kind of look at market areas because, the UK is actually quite a big market. And I know this sounds funny, but there aren't that many IKEA stores. So we kind of sort of look at it and say, well, what region would naturally gravitate to the IKEA store in Milton Keynes? And we kind of draw a line, and I'm not going to be very scientific here, which I suppose starts at the Wash, Kings Lynn kind of way, works its way down sort of south of Nottingham. Somewhere around about Rugby, it turns south and heads towards sort of Aylesbury, Luton way, then turns back towards the coast, and somewhere sort of that Essex, Suffolk kind of, there's a line that goes back to the coast. And so then we say that actually in that area, everyone will go to Milton Keynes in some way, shape or form. And so the idea when we say that the market manager is responsible for the region or the area is it's about, we want to have that kind of point of view that we're thinking about how do we reach our customers, whether they're actually living right next to us or they're living 3 hours drive time away. And it's a really sort of, for me, as a sort of a leadership challenge, it's not about maybe the operations that take place day to day in the Milton Keynes store, but it's also thinking about what am I doing that's maybe positioning the brand in this market? What am I doing that's maybe making IKEA more accessible for the people who are maybe living on the Norfolk coast? But I think I also need to say that, of course, I'm massively supported by the sort of central organization in the UK. And part of this work of getting out and into the region and reaching these people is very much done in concert. So I don't want to give the impression that I'm doing it all myself.
So we started in Croydon.
Yeah.
We've been to Norway.
Yes.
We've been to Switzerland.
Yes.
Now we're back in the UK in Milton Keynes.
Yes.
And what I would consider possibly the true breakthrough moment in your career, being cornered by me at a business expo where I twisted your arm into joining me for this episode of Culture Crush. So I consider that somewhat of a pinnacle. I'm sure they agree.
It's already on my CV.
Wonderful. Glad to hear. Now, you obviously have a lot of people, I guess, in the IKEA pyramid or the IKEA structure who are under your leadership at this point. And you are very much you're leading at scale with a large community of people. And I imagine what's put you in good stead, you mentioned this before, is that because you'd risen through the ranks and because you knew what life is like for people on the shop floor, so to speak, because you understand that world through your own lens of experience, that must have stood you in good stead. But I'm wondering if you could give us an idea of the sense of scale that you are responsible for now, like how many people are following your leadership and relying on your guidance, but also what are some of the highlights or things that have been important in helping you lead at that kind of scale?
So I think in Milton Keynes, we're about 450 people altogether. And I think this is the really interesting thing that people maybe don't understand just how big IKEA is. So that's quite a lot of people. And I think sort of to the second half of your question, it's again impossible to do things by yourself. You can't simply be in everything and be the leader for all those people. So of course, one of the sort of the two key sort of things that I rely on is leading through my leaders, leading through my managers, and then the kind of the culture and values of IKEA. Because I think these two things create a very powerful combination. And I think, you have to think that when you're in a leadership position and you're maybe in a very visible leadership position, it's what permission structures do you create for the organization around you? And I think that, if you're someone who takes control of everything, you're obviously saying, and we'll get onto this a little bit later, I'm sure, in more detail, that sends one signal and creates certain permission structures for the organization. Whereas for me, and I think I bring a little bit of this from my experience working in Norway and Finland, where it's much more sort of Nordic and the hierarchy is extremely flat, maybe compared to the UK. And it's about how do I create the structure where it's absolutely encouraged for us to lead through our people. So that means that my sort of functional managers who have their own departments, how are they then leading through their managers and team leaders, etc.? And how do we sort of spread that all the way through the organization? One of the challenges, of course, in leading at that kind of an organization that big is sooner or later you might hit bottlenecks in trying to cascade it down. So it's especially challenging to sort of make sure that we get the messages through to the guys who are working on the shop floor. the guys who may be coming in and doing like a 4-hour shift, how do we actually also involve them? And I think that's the sort of the ongoing challenge.
There are two things there, David, that I think are really, really interesting. The first is how you're involving those people who have what they might feel like less skin in the game with IKEA's story. Perhaps they're working shorter shifts, they're less involved in the community at kind of a tangible level. And I love the intention and the deliberate approach to include and involve and listen to them. But I also love how you're reflecting on how you've learned from those flat structures from Norway and Switzerland, and how you're bringing some of those disciplines into how you're leading in the UK, and encouraging your leaders and the people who report into you to take responsibility. And I guess leverage the autonomy and the brevity that you're able to give to them as their senior leader. One of the things that we love to talk about on the show, we're obviously going to get to some really practical things, a leadership challenge and a solution related to organizational culture. But one of our best stops, our most exciting stops on this journey is the culture crush. Who is your culture crush? And I have to say, what I love about IKEA as a foundation-led organization is the organization's relationship to its values that are super practical, super tangible. They're not sort of abstract, weird messages in a lobby somewhere. They're practical tools that people can apply to the way they work and the way they lead. So IKEA certainly would be, and I'm not just trying to make you feel good, David, but IKEA certainly would be one of my culture crushes. But I know that you've been thinking about your culture crush. So why don't you give us an idea of who that is and why?
So my culture crush is the Samaritans. And I know it's not a business organization, and it's a little bit of a left field one. But, if you look at what they're doing in our community in the UK today, it's actually kind of interesting how they're set up, how they try and strike that balance to help people who need help, but do so in a kind of a professional way, a respectful way, a non-judgmental way. And I think the reason why I sort of gravitate to them and see it is it really comes back to that non-judgment sort of element. I think we're very, very quick as human beings to rush to judgment. A little bit this kind of, you can call it unconscious bias, you can call it conscious bias. For whatever reason, the UK, we're extremely tribal. Are you red? Are you blue? I'm talking about football, not general elections, all of these kind of things. We kind of want to be in our group. And I think there's an organization out there that's kind of like then trying to help people who need help and doing it in an absolutely non-judgmental way. And if I kind of then circle that back a little bit to how I take that into my kind of everyday world, and a little bit to what you were saying when you were wrapping up about maybe some of the people who are not as invested in IKEA because maybe they do a short-term contract or they're students, I kind of come back and and this is a very personal reflection. I've got one life. And I want to get the most out of it. So yes, I have to go to work because you have to get paid. But wouldn't it be great if actually work wasn't just about getting through it to get the money? That kind of leads to a sort of a leadership point of view, which sort of says, actually, one of the most important things I can do is be non-judgmental about the people who are with me. And being non-judgmental leads to having a respect for them, regardless of where you sit in the organization. And if you're having a situation where the person is feeling valued, respected, etc., you are much more likely to have an engaging topic. So that's kind of how I reflected on this and brought my culture crush back to how it actually sort of inspires me.
That's really, really interesting. You've got this difference that exists there between having to be a decision maker as a leader and having to make judgments as a leader. Mm-hmm. And actually how you approach the people that work for you and maintain a non-judgmental stance that says, I am not here to provide commentary about how I think you're leading your life or how I think you're approaching the challenges that you might face. Now, sometimes as a leader, there are decisions that need to be made because, as you say, we walk this fine line between who we are as people and who the organization needs us to be. And there are decisions that need to be made. But I love the nuance there between being a decision maker. And I know that I'm sort of framing what you said ever so slightly differently, or hopefully adding to it. But framing yourself, recognizing that you are sometimes a decision maker, but that doesn't mean that you have to be a judge or a jury or the person who's making some kind of personal statement about this individual. And I think that's a really interesting tension.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you wanted to add to that, because I know that I've sort of added some additional framing there.
No, I mean, and I reflect actually that when I worked in Finland, I had a boss, and he was an absolute nightmare in the nicest possible way, because he was just so hard driving. No matter what you did, there was always, it's just da 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 da. But then there'd be this kind of like 6 o'clock. He'd say, "Okay, we're finished. Who wants to go for a beer?" And I'd always put my hand up, and I'd always go. And at some point, I started thinking, why? And I realized at some point that his approach and his demanding nature was always professional. It was always about the business. It was never personal. I was never belittled. He might not be satisfied. He might, but he never belittled me. And I think that was a very powerful lesson for me. So perhaps that was in there. And then when I was, reflecting on this kind of crush element, and I was aware that the Samaritans try to be extremely non-judgmental, and it's vital to what they do. I obviously sort of made the link there. And then to circle back again, and you think about your role, you have, and I talked about permission structures earlier, and we're drifting into culture here a little bit, but you set the tone for your organization. And of course, I'm working within the framework that IKEA is giving me. Nothing that I'm doing, if any of my colleagues ever listen to this, will say, well, we do that too. This is just my spin on it. But you set the tone as the leader, and you can create an environment, or you can aim or have an ambition to create an environment that is kind of, as flat as possible, where there's a lot of mutual respect, where there's a lot of giving and taking of responsibility. But then, you also have that knowledge that, yes, maybe if something goes, badly wrong, you have to step in and put on the other hat, which is, and that's okay. And that's also if you take the role, you obviously have the ambition to make things as great as possible, but you also have the understanding that you will take the tough decisions if you need to, but make the tough decisions because they're based on the business and not because it's personal about the person.
I love that we've brought the Samaritans into this conversation. I am a huge fan of that organization. And I love the way that the organization is just set up to listen, to involve people, to include people, to not make judgments about people. And it's just so countercultural to the way the world of social media works, the way organizations works, the way relationships works. Because there's always that tension between two people interacting. And what I love about Samaritans is that they're saying, we are here to listen, just to hear you, just to allow you to speak your truth, whatever that may be. And one of the things that day to day, we don't live with that opportunity a lot of the time. And I think one of the things that I'd like to say to our listeners is, if actually you're an employee and you are struggling with a difficult relationship with a boss, and somebody who you may interpret a lot of the way that they behave as personal, because I think the door here swings the other way as well. I would encourage you, take a step away from the situation for a moment and just consider whether that person is making personal judgments about you, or whether they are in a deciding role and they're sort of operating within the constraints of their role. Because sometimes that might give you a more gracious lens on how that relationship is unfolding. And it may help you to realize that you're not being personally judged. Now, the way they're handling that conversation might not be very productive for you. It might not feel very helpful. But actually, bearing in mind the difference between judgment and decision maker might just help you take the pressure out on your side. So I would encourage anybody perhaps who's in that situation to sort of reframe, okay, what's really happening in this relationship, and do I need to take it personally? Because that might just help take some of the pressure out as far as you can control it. Now, I'm glad you mentioned that we're kind of moving into the culture space, because one of the things that you've been thinking through is a challenge around leadership, or a challenge around culture that you are particularly aware of at the moment, and a solution or a framework or an approach that people can try to do something about it. So why don't you take those 2 points together and talk us through the leadership challenge or culture challenge that you would like to talk about for today's episode, and then just kind of take us into the solution area, because I'm sure people are really keen to hear what they can actually do about these things.
Yes. Okay. Well, obviously, the names have been changed to protect the innocent. Before I begin, it's probably worthwhile to say that. So, in my past, in the role as a market manager, I have been in a unit where there was a lot of staff turnover. And I think this is a critical challenge. You know, if you think from a business point of view, we invest a lot of time in finding staff. We invest a lot of time in training people. We invest a lot of time in trying to create a culture, etc. And if you have a lot of movement, you're undoing all your good work. You know, it's a bit like sort of trying to fill up a bucket with a hole in it. The water's always going to run out, and the bucket will never be full. So I was in a unit which had a very, very high staff turnover. I do know the exact figure, but I'll say it's over 50%, and measured in a period of 12 months. So that is very, very significant. And I was new into that role. And of course, understanding that gave me a little bit the EBGBs, as it would. And that's kind of like as a leader, that you have to make a significant change here. This is kind of, I'm almost going to say triage. Obviously, that's very dramatic. But there's a little bit of the house is on fire, shall we say, and you need to solve that. So I suppose the kind of approach here is you're a leader. So you're trying to lead, and you have to get at what is going on underneath here. And for me, you know, leadership is also a lot about conscious decisions. So I kind of said, okay, I need to correct this. I need to bring this right the way down. I need to get this back at least, you know, to sort of like a benchmark level, which, you know, would probably be a sort of reduction of sort of, you know, 60, 70% in terms of the turnover, or an increase in the people we're managing to retain by 60 to 70%. Really, there were two sort of main phases to that process. So, and I think, you know, if you want to sort of think about what you can take away, you've got some of the sort of, I'm going to say, the technical aspects, where there are things you can do very quickly to strip away bottlenecks, get them out of the way, because then that gets you to what's going on underneath with the people. So I think, you know, you need to sort of, you want to take something away, you're saying, okay, what is technical and what is personal in terms of involves people, so business and people. So one of the things I discovered very quickly, though, was in terms of the allocations of resources that had been made available had been done really, really poorly. I'm sorry to say. You know, you get a budget for a year and it had been divided by 12 and just sent out. And now, of course, no business in the world runs on a flat, constant level. Everything goes up and everything goes down. And of course, with a little bit of sort of planning, you can plan your resource to be more when the business is busier, and you can plan your resource to be less when the business is quieter. But it was interesting. I was getting a little bit of resistance. People were concerned about overspending on budgets, which isn't a bad thing. You know, we all need to hit our budgets because that's how the business will turn a profit. And I just remember the conversation, you know, like, actually, do you know what? If the turnover is this high, we can throw money at it, because we're not going to breach the budget, because we will always be losing people faster than we're replacing them. And that was one of those things that landed. You know, sometimes if it's on fire, put some water on it, get it out. So we actually very quickly, we opened the sluice gates in terms of recruiting resource. At that point, I knew very clearly that yes, there is an inherent risk in that. And I think, again, when you look at management and leadership, there are always risks in any decision you take. And your job is very much about how do you manage the risk? How do you ensure that you kind of have control? You're wagging the tail is not wagging you. But my decision at that point was, okay, we open the floodgates, we get resource in, we stem the bleeding. And of course, I knew that then further on, as time went by, I would have to make sure that we engineered then a soft landing in terms of, at some point we then have to start slowly turning the tap off as we sort of stabilize things. So that was the first thing that got people in place and was started to sort of fill in some of the gaps. Because of course, what you were having and the reason why people were leaving, if you don't have enough resource, they get overworked, they get overtired, they get disengaged, they don't want to be part of it. So all of the things I talked about earlier in terms of the culture and trying to sort of walk the walk as an organization, they were going out the window a little bit. So, you just by putting bodies on the line, you start to make it easier in the day-to-day reality of the people who are doing the hard yards every day and meeting the great British public. So we kind of got that bit going, and that was okay. And then that allowed us to turn our attention to maybe the deeper cultural issues that were going on. And maybe I began to understand that from a legacy point of view, people didn't want to take responsibility. And what I mean here, and I need to be maybe a bit more specific, is the leaders didn't want to lead. The leaders felt that almost they'd been disempowered some way along the line. And it was very clear that part of my job was to try and get people back into leading. Get people back into developing their people, engaging with these kind of processes, giving the co-workers reasons to actually be part of the company, to stay, all of these things we've talked about. So it was very much a case that, I had to then really roll up my sleeves and get on with it. And with my direct sort of leadership team, it was how did we get out there and how did we lead by example? And then actually one of the things here is how did we lead with empathy? And how did we lead with authenticity? And we often talk a lot about leading with example, and leading with example is great, but you also need to think about leading with empathy, because empathy is a great tool where you actually begin to build trust with people. And if you build trust with people, you can have an honest dialogue with people. And if you have an honest dialogue with people, you can understand where they are. And if you understand where they are, you're better able to help them. And then I think we also know a lot about leading with authenticity. And this is massively, massively important if you're a leader. I kind of like one of the tools I use, and I'm really super open with people when they ask me stuff all the time. And I kind of have 3 standard responses. It's, I know and I can tell you, I know and I can't tell you, or I don't know. But it's a wonderfully easy and simple way of just being authentic with people. Because, sometimes there is commercially sensitive information. I'm wandering off the point here. I will come back to it, I promise, Dan. Sometimes there's commercially sensitive stuff and you can't talk about it. But just acknowledge that it's there and move on. It gives you that sense of, okay, I'm being treated with respect. I'm being treated on it openly. That's fine. If the person keeps coming back at you, you say, sorry, no, and you move on. So we were trying to actually then engage the sort of the leadership. And I would say, and this sounds really judgmental, and I don't mean it to be judgmental, because in the organization, you have myself at the top, you have then the functional managers who are responsible for the departments. And our bottleneck was at the level of the people who were actually managing the day-to-day teams. So it was really about getting in with those people and really trying to help them. And that is a slow boat or a slow burn. You have to understand that if you're in that, you're not going to solve this overnight. Some people will get it sooner than others, and some people will take longer. And it's about staying with that process. And I think if I can sort of get into a kind of couple of tools that I sort of use when I'm talking to people and trying to help them to understand what it is. Because, a big organization, we have competence profiles, we have, follow-up talks, we have annual reviews, we have a lot of material. So it's how do you use that material? So I often always give myself a sort of how do we work with people's sort of intelligence versus knowledge? And what I mean by that is, never underestimate anyone's intelligence, never overestimate their knowledge. And so when you're trying to talk to people, it's not what you need them to do, it's what you need them to do and why you need them to do it. And I think this idea of people do want to be involved, and that ability of sort of understand, or that sort of desire for understanding, Dan, is really super important. So I think as a leader, one of the sort of, whatever tool it is you use, just recognize that behind it, the human need you've got there is people's need for understanding. And if you're able to meet that need for understanding, you're going to have people who want to be involved. You're going to have people who start to understand what you're talking about. You're going to have people who want to sort of work in the way that you're setting out. Because the other thing about people is they do want leadership. They do want a structure. They do want a framework. And if you start to provide those things, they will start to work within those. And then you can help them to actually succeed. So I think from a culture point of view, you're also talking about you're setting out to help people succeed. You're not setting people up to fail. So it's about making positive, conscious choices. And then there's sort of various other things that, things that I picked up as well. I had one coworker a long time ago. And I remember there was a Christmas party, and I was, for whatever reason, I was driving, so I was stone cold sober. And this person got a little bit drunk and started bugging me all night about, oh, you don't like me, you don't like me, you don't like me. And I was doing my best to be very polite, diplomatic, etc. It's just one of those things that happens in life. But then, you're in an organization, there's people you like, there's people you like less. And I had somebody I got on with really well. We thought along the same lines. And they asked me something. They wanted to do something that was kind of outside the norm. And then I think that had a kind of like light bulb moment where I sort of went, what answer would I give if the person who bugged me at the party had asked me this? And I kind of learned, this kind of like became a little bit of a test for me. And the reason why I'm bringing this up, Dan, is because this talks to the idea of how you treat people with equality, how you treat people with equity. Because I think, I've talked a little bit about, creating the framework, you've got to have leadership, you've got to be authentic. But there are other elements and other tools that you have to utilize in order to move the organization forward, solve this challenge of bringing down the massive turnover. And people are aware of what's going on around them in an organization. And people will spot if there is favorable treatment and unfavorable treatment. So what do you do as a leader when you're trying your best to be as equitable and to treat people as consistently as possible? So I have this little test that I use. So I always think about, who do I like least? Because I am human. And when I've got a request, if I find myself saying yes to that request, then I know that request is okay. I know that request is in line with our culture. I know that request is in line with our values. I know that request is in line with our sort of policies, etc. So I know that it's a good decision, a way to make a good decision. So, we have this process going on. I've stripped away some of the sort of the mechanical things. I'm working with my senior leadership team to sort of like create a framework, to lead, to create the permission structures that I've talked about earlier. And then I'm also sort of thinking about how do I get into the space where I'm sort of working with the people. And this is where I talk about the intelligence and the knowledge, where I'm sort of thinking about how do I treat people equally. So you can see I'm starting to put together all of these things. And I know it sounds like I was really I had it all mapped out. And I want to be honest and say, I use these things and I recognize I use these things, but I don't think I was maybe always as conscious as I'm trying to explain it now. And then I think the other thing that, the third sort of pillar here is a little bit about the business. And I think, if you've got something going wrong, we are very, very fast to sort of get straight into the solution. We're task orientated. I know how to fix that. Let's go. Sometimes it's really, really good to stay in the question. What is it that's making us uncomfortable? Why is this a problem? Don't fix what you see on the surface. Reflect a little bit underneath. And I guess this kind of kicks into a little bit sort of also conscious choices from your sort of leadership point of view. Do you want to make a fast horse faster, or are you happy to sort of have this kind of like, it's Kaizen, isn't it? It's sort of this Japanese idea of incremental improvements, which has been used to great effect. I think one of the car manufacturers, I forget, uses that all the time. But, stay in that question. And then the other thing that I like to do very much, and it's a tool that I love completely, is this kind of to shift the discussion from either or when we're talking about decisions. It's not binary. How do we move to both and? It opens up the world. It opens up all kinds of opportunities. So we were using all of these kind of tools in one shape, way or another. And we started that process. And of course, what happens? We brought the turnover way down. In fact, we smashed it. We brought it down below the benchmark. And obviously, the second part of that, about getting the leaders to be leaders, is a task that took much longer. But, everybody moved in the right direction. And we made a difference to the everyday of everybody who worked in that unit.
One of the things I loved when you were reflecting on that journey is you recognize that although you're talking us through this now with a high level of clarity about, we did this and we did that and we did that, which is easy to do in retrospect, right? It's easy to kind of sound like an expert when you look back and you kind of like pick out the things that really worked well. But I love that you were really honest about that in saying that these are my words, this is my kind of how I've interpreted it, but how you were sort of figuring out some of these things and looking for the solutions and applying them sort of as you went. You realize that this car is moving and we've got to build it, but it's happening now. One of the other things I love about this story is that there's kind of two phases, right? There's like an urgent surgery phase where you've got to do some cutting, where you've got to do some operational work, when you've got to get the organization on the table and get a team of surgeons around it, trying to figure out, okay, how do we actually make some decisions now? How do we triage this problem now? And then there's a phase, which is the rehabilitation phase, when you're starting to think about, okay, so how do we get people now to own this? How do I encourage the leaders around me to own this and begin to shape the culture going forward? Because you've got to deal with the immediate problem as an organization, right? You've got to try and think, okay, how do we take action against this now? But then as you have reflected, there is then this phase of, okay, how do we now embed and influence and rehabilitate going forward?
Mm-hmm.
And it's the combination of things that led you guys to beating the benchmarks and actually not just fixing the problem, but actually fixing it in such a way that you can now come on a podcast and talk through your process. But also, I'm sure there were changes that were then implemented across the organization as well. And I loved what you were saying here about how you were leading. I picked out a couple of words which I think are really powerful. First was empathy. What were those three phrases you used? Like, I know but can't say I know. Can you just repeat those for us?
I know and I can tell you. I know and I can't tell you. I don't know.
I love that because you're acknowledging that there are some barriers to what you can and can't say with somebody. And even that kind of disrupts the mystery that might be making them feel uncomfortable, even though, like, for them to know that there are things that I can't be told yet, but I know that those things have been thought about. Even that, if you're not involved in the conversation, even that is useful because it puts that person back on solid ground. Mm-hmm. So I love that idea of leading with empathy. You also mentioned leading with clarity, which I think kind of plays into that same point as well. But also the way you challenged yourself around equity and about how you deal with those personalities that perhaps you experience friction with, and you're not necessarily, there's not as much warmth in that relationship.
Mm.
Can you as a leader challenge yourself to lead with equity and spot when actually it's just your personality and their personality. There's a bit of friction. But how do you avoid treating them unfairly purely because there's a clash of personalities and it's nothing more? I think that is such an important challenge for leaders. How do you lead with more equity? Now, we are coming into land, David, and we always love to finish on something super practical, a starting point for people to take away and try. Now, you may have already considered this, and we might have already covered this, so it might be something else that you want to add just in these final stages. But if there was one thing that you could encourage people to take away and try it today, what would that be and why?
For me, it's about people wanting to understand. And I think, we sometimes think of business as a battle, we think of life as a battle, but actually the people who come and work for us, there's a reason why they join this company or your company. There's a reason why they want to be there. Yeah, there's a small minority who may be just doing it for the paycheck. But there are normally other things involved. So the key takeaway for me is that people want to be involved. And one of the best ways to create involvement, engagement, is to help people understand what we're doing, why we're doing. And that sort of, as a leadership, because that then informs your conscious decisions. How do I help my people understand why we're doing X? It is so powerful. It really, and then, I rattled through quite a few sort of different sort of practical ways that you can apply that. But that is the key thing. That is your that launches you as a leader. And it creates your framework for interacting with your people and making your people feel more valued, because then the people stay longer. And that's great for your business. It's great for your customers, and it's great for the future.
I think that is such a wonderful way for us to wrap up the episode. The invitation to a more conscious level of leadership where you're thinking not just about the things that you've got to say, but also how. And how are you going to respond to people's desire to be involved? Because they want to go with you.
Yeah.
But it's down to you to try and figure out how you involve them in the right way. David, as I mentioned, we are just about to bring the show into land. And I just wanted to say thank you. It's been such a fascinating conversation. Thank you for making some time for Culture Crush.
Thank you very much, Dan. I've had a great time.
And that's a wrap for today's episode of Culture Crush. If you enjoyed your time with us, please do your thing and like and subscribe wherever you're listening from. And if you're a Culture First leader, be sure to visit anthem.oo because we've got lots in common. See you next time.